Story 1. It was 2 a.m. when I saw him, a tall, skinny man with long, tangled dreads, moving down the staircase in absolute silence. Something about him felt wrong. Maybe it was the way his feet barely made a sound against the concrete, or the eerie stillness that followed in his wake. But what really sent chills down my spine was what happened next. He walked into the bathroom. I followed. And yet, when I stepped inside, the room was empty, completely. No sign of him, no footsteps, no movement, just silence. At that moment, my breath hitched. I knew every prisoner in that block by name, by face, by habit, and the man I had just seen, he was not supposed to be there. Working the night shift at a prison is not for the faint-hearted. The building itself carries a weight, an energy that clings to you like an unseen presence lurking in the dark. I had been on the job for only a few months, still getting used to the silent corridors, the distant whispers, the feeling of being watched. But nothing could have prepared me for that night. It was past midnight, and I was covering an overtime shift in one of the older housing units. This block had seen its fair share of violence, death, and despair. Stories whispered between guards, stories we were never meant to talk about. Medium security meant inmates were locked in their cells, but they still had permission to use the communal bathroom during the night, a simple enough rule. At precisely 2 a.m., I started my routine count. The hall was dimly lit, shadows stretching unnaturally across the cold concrete floors. That was when I saw him, a tall, gaunt man, descending the stairs from the second level. His walk was slow, deliberate, his long dreads swaying slightly with each step. He never looked at me, never acknowledged my presence, just walked straight into the bathroom. I followed a few seconds later, standing at the entrance. "What cell are you in?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. Silence. I stepped inside, scanning the stalls, checking every inch of the room. It was empty. I felt my stomach drop. There was no possible way he had left without me seeing him. I was at the only entrance, and the bathroom had no windows, no vents large enough for anyone to escape through. He had walked in, and then he was gone. A shiver ran down my spine as I stood frozen, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe I was exhausted, my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe he had somehow slipped past me in the shadows. Maybe. But deep down, I knew better. I hurried back to the main hallway, my pulse pounding in my ears. As soon as I saw my coworker, I blurted out, "I just saw someone go into the bathroom." But when I went in, there was no one there. They stopped mid-step, eyes narrowing slightly. What did he look like? I swallowed. Tall, skinny, long dreads, a beat of silence. Then, in a tone so casual it made my skin crawl, my coworker said, "Oh, that's just Mr. Bones." The name alone sent a chill through me. "Who the hell is Mr. Bones?" they exhaled, shaking their head. "An inmate. Used to be. Hanged himself in that very bathroom a few years ago. He never really left." I stared at them, waiting for them to crack a grin to tell me it was some kind of sick joke. But there was no humor in their eyes, only quiet acceptance. Goosebumps prickled along my arms as I turned back toward the bathroom, now just an open doorway leading into darkness. That was years ago. I have worked countless shifts since then, but I never stepped into that bathroom alone again. Some nights, I hear footsteps when no one is there. Sometimes, I see a flicker of movement on the second level, a shadow where no shadow should be. And every now and then, when I glance toward the bathroom at exactly 2 a.m., I see him standing there, watching, waiting. Even now, I cannot explain what I saw that night. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was paranoia, or maybe some spirits refused to leave the place where they died. What do you think? Can places really hold the echoes of the past? Let me know in the comments, if you dare. Story 2. It started with the sound of tires, soft, deliberate, circling me like a predator sizing up its prey. A young man on a bike, weaving around my car in slow, measured loops. His face was unreadable under the dim streetlights, but his intent was clear. He was not just riding, he was watching. Every night, he got closer. Each time, the space between us shrank until I could feel the weight of his stare pressing against my skin. Then, one night, he was gone. But something far worse took his place. I worked as an overnight baker in a downtown area where parking was free but scarce. That night, I had to leave my car a block away, forcing me to walk alone through the quiet streets. That was when I first saw him, the guy on the bike. He circled me slowly, his head tilted, watching. I quickened my pace, my keys clenched in my fist, my breath coming faster. When I finally reached the bakery and locked the door behind me, I turned to see him, still there, just beyond the glass, motionless. Then, just as suddenly, he pedaled away. The next night, he was waiting, and the next. Each time, he followed me closer, his presence more unsettling. At 4 a.m., my boss arrived looking disturbed. "That kid on the bike," he said. "He was circling me too." It was no coincidence. Over the next few days, he became more aggressive, weaving between parked cars, his eyes locked onto me like I was some kind of game. Then, one night, he made his move, charging at my boss, full speed, trying to ram him. My boss barely escaped, slipping between two vehicles. And then, just like that, the biker was gone. We never saw him again. For a while I thought it was over. I was wrong. One humid summer night, I sat outside on a busy sidewalk, my usual spot during my break. Across the street, the cold concrete of a federal building stood against the dark sky. Lifeless and imposing, I was lost in thought, sipping my drink, when I felt it, that same suffocating feeling of being watched. I looked up. A figure was walking toward me from the far end of the block. But something was wrong. Even under the glow of the streetlights, the person's face was a void. Their entire body was wrapped in shadow, as if the light refused to touch them. The air around me turned heavy, like the atmosphere shifted with their presence. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I knew that if I waited too long, if I let them get too close, something terrible would happen. I jumped to my feet, nearly knocking over my chair, and rushed inside, locking the door behind me. My breath came in short gasps as I peered through a small window, watching for the shadow to pass. 5 minutes, 10. The sidewalk stayed empty. The street was still alive with people, but no one, not a single soul, walked past the bakery. That was 15 years ago. The biker never came back. But the shadow, the thing in the dark, I still feel it. Some nights, I catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a flicker of something standing just beyond the glow of the streetlights, watching, waiting. What do you think? Can some things linger beyond explanation? Have you ever felt that eerie sensation of being watched, only to find no one there? Story 3. At first I thought he was still alive. The way his chest moved ever so slightly, the faint gurgling noise that echoed in the cold night air, it convinced me he was still breathing. My hands trembled as I pressed my fingers to his wrist, searching for a pulse. I could feel it. I was sure I could feel it. But when the paramedics arrived, they only exchanged a knowing glance before one of them murmured, "He has been dead for hours." That was the first time I found a body at the gas station, but it was not the last. I worked the night shift at a 24-hour gas station and fast food joint in the worst part of town. The place never really shut down, and neither did the people who wandered in after midnight. Crackheads, drifters, people looking for trouble. You get used to the chaos, the bizarre conversations, the kind of things that make you question reality. there was the guy who gave me a magic crystal to protect me from the apocalypse. After I covered the few cents, he was short for a hot dog. Another time, a man tried to buy cigarettes with a handful of freshly cut grass, claiming, "I know it ain't weed, but it works almost just as good." He then promptly passed out, standing at my register. I thought I had seen it all, until the night I found them. It was around 3:45 a.m., and the air outside was thick with humidity. The store had been unusually quiet, a rare break from the usual late-night madness. I had just stepped out for a smoke when I noticed the dumpster area behind the building. Something about it felt off. A heavy stillness lingered there, the kind that makes your skin prickle before your brain catches up. That was when I saw them. Two men, slumped against the dumpster, motionless. At first, I thought they were just passed out, another pair of regulars who had overdone it and picked a bad spot to crash. But as I got closer, the unease in my gut grew heavier. Their bodies looked unnatural, too still. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched beside them, my hands shaking as I reached for the first man's wrist. His skin was ice cold, but then I swear I felt it. A faint pulse, a weak sign of life just beneath the surface, and then the sound, a low, wet gurgling from his throat. He was still breathing. He had to be. I bolted inside and called 911, my voice cracking as I explained the situation. The minutes stretched like hours until I saw the flashing lights of an ambulance pull into the lot. Relief washed over me as the EMTs rushed in, but it did not last long. One of them knelt beside the first man, checked his vitals, and then shook his head. "They have been gone for hours," he said, voice flat. "No," I blurted out. "I heard something. I felt—" The EMT cut me off with a glance, the kind that meant something, like he had seen this before, like he knew. "You are not the first person to say that," he muttered, barely above a whisper. The bodies were taken away, and the silence that followed was deafening. I went back inside, numb, trying to process what had just happened. But the unease never left. It stayed with me, whispering in the back of my mind, something is not right, because that was the first time I found a body at the gas station, but it was not the last. I never forgot that night, and sometimes when I step outside after dark, I still hear it, the faintest gurgling sound in the distance. Maybe it is just the wind, or maybe something never left. Story 4. I turned off the last light, plunging the warehouse behind me into complete darkness. The air felt different, heavier. My skin prickled as if something unseen had just stepped closer. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves after a long shift. Then, just as I reached the final exit, I glanced back one last time. A shadow moved, not a flicker, not a trick of the light. Someone was there, watching. I called the cops. They arrived, weapons drawn. Minutes later, the gunfire echoed through the building. One of them died. And I never stopped wondering, what if I had just walked away? I worked night shifts at a massive warehouse, the kind of place that felt abandoned even when it was not. The ceiling stretched high above me, the dim overhead lights flickering just enough to remind me how much darkness lurked in the corners. It was a routine job. Lock up, check the doors, turn off the lights, one by one, as I moved through the building. But that night, something felt wrong. It started as a feeling, the itch of unseen eyes on my back. Every time I switched off another section, the darkness behind me swallowed the space whole. The silence grew heavier with each step, pressing against my ears like a thick fog. My hands felt clammy on the keys. My breath was too loud. Something inside me whispered, "Do not turn around." By the time I reached the last exit, my heart was hammering in my chest. Still, I hesitated. The unease had built to a point where it was almost suffocating. I took one final glance over my shoulder. That was when I saw it. A figure, just barely visible, peeking out from behind a stack of crates. A head, a shoulder, then gone. My stomach clenched. Someone was inside. I did not hesitate. I stepped outside, locked the door behind me, and called the cops. I described what I had seen, my voice tight, every nerve on edge. The dispatcher kept asking if I was sure it was not just a shadow, if I had seen movement. But I knew what I saw. A squad car arrived minutes later. The officers went in, flashlights and weapons drawn. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then, gunshots, loud, sharp, echoing out of the warehouse like thunder. I stood frozen as the radio chatter buzzed with urgency. Moments later, an officer stepped out, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly. One suspect was down. When everything settled, the truth came out. 2 kids, 14 years old. They had snuck into the warehouse before I started locking up. Just a couple of dumb teenagers looking for a place to hide out, maybe mess around. When the cops found them, they panicked. They started throwing things, a coffee cup, a wrench, whatever they could find in the dark. One of the objects shattered behind an officer, and in the confusion, he fired. One shot, straight to the chest, instant death. His friend, standing just inches away, did not even get a scratch. The cop was a rookie, 6 months on the job. He swore he thought he was being shot at. The department backed him up. It was a tragedy, a terrible accident, an unfortunate misunderstanding, but no one had to see what I saw. When everything calmed down, I was asked to go inside. I did not want to, but I had to sign off on the report, confirm the timeline. So I stepped back into the warehouse, into the dimly lit maze of shelves and shadows, and there he was. The boy's body was sprawled on the cold concrete floor, his limbs twisted at an unnatural angle. The blood had already started pooling beneath him, dark and spreading, like ink spilled across a page. His eyes still open. I stood there, numb, barely hearing the officers talking around me. Something about how the family would be contacted, how the case would be handled. But all I could focus on was the silence. The warehouse had been empty, just me and the dark. So why, even now, did I still feel watched? I had to go through months of depositions, questioning, therapy. People asked if I felt guilty. But what haunted me was not just the death. It was that unshakable feeling that something else had been there with us that night. I saw a shadow move before I called the cops, but there were only 2 kids in the warehouse. So tell me, if it was not them, then who was watching me? Story 5. The doorbell rang at 3 a.m. It was a secure dementia care facility, a locked building. No one was supposed to be coming or going at that hour. The sound echoed through the empty hallways, making my skin crawl. I checked the front window. No one was there. 10 minutes later, it rang again. I was alone. 15 residents, most of them lost in their own worlds, unable to help if something went wrong. My on-call supervisor would not answer. She never did on weekends. Then, one of the residents turned to me and whispered, "Do not open the door alone. He might hurt you." I felt my stomach drop. I had not told anyone the doorbell was ringing. For years, I worked night shifts in residential care facilities. The job had its eerie moments, but nothing like the night I was alone in a soul-charged dementia care home. It was a converted boarding house, just 1 floor, with 15 residents and me, the only staff on duty. At 3 o'clock a.m., I had just finished my routine rounds checking on each resident. That was when I heard it, the doorbell. A sound so ordinary during the day, but in the middle of the night, in a locked-down facility, it felt unnatural. I froze. The front door was secured, and when there was no reason anyone should be outside. A wave of cold unease settled over me, making the hairs on my arms stand up. Slowly, I walked to the window and peered out. Nothing. Just an empty front porch and a quiet street beyond it. I convinced myself it was my imagination, maybe even a wiring issue. Then, 10 minutes later, the bell rang again, louder this time. I checked again, still nothing. But my eyes caught something new. Across the street, parked beneath the dim glow of a street lamp, sat an unfamiliar car. No movement inside, no driver stepping out, just waiting. Uneasy but trying to stay rational, I snapped a photo of it on my phone, just in case. Then I went back to my station, where one of the residents, a sweet elderly woman with advanced dementia, was sitting at the table playing a card game with me. As I sat down, she gave me a knowing look and smiled. "What did the gentleman want, dear? He looked like he had a bad night. Maybe he needs a cup of tea." My stomach tightened. She had not been near the window. She had no way of knowing the doorbell had even rung. But before I could react, the bell rang again. By now, I was shaking. As I got up, another resident shuffled past me. A frail man with a clean paintbrush in his hand, painting imaginary strokes in the air, was something we gave him to do to keep him calm. As I stepped toward the front hallway, he glanced up and said, "Do not open the door alone. He might hurt you." I stopped mid-step. My pulse thundered in my ears. I had not told anyone about the doorbell. I pressed myself against the wall near the window, barely breathing as I peeked outside. The car was still there, but this time I saw movement. A shadow, no, a person, stepping around the side of the building. I barely had time to process what was happening before he turned and looked right at me. Our eyes locked through the glass. I screamed. The man bolted. The entire facility erupted in confusion. My scream had woken several residents, some of whom started crying, others mumbling to themselves in half-forgotten voices from another time. I grabbed the phone with shaking hands and called the police. I barely got the words out. The officers arrived within minutes, but the man was already gone. They searched the area, questioned me, and tried to reassure the residents as best as they could, but the fear lingered. I knew what I had seen. He had been watching, waiting. By the time things settled, it was nearly 7 a.m. and the morning shift had arrived. I was still rattled, my hands trembling as I recounted everything that had happened. That was when one of the nurses froze. "There was a woman a few houses down," she said slowly. "She was attacked last night. A man broke in looking for drugs." Everything in me went cold. Our facility had a med room stocked with high-grade painkillers, morphine, fentanyl, methadone. What if he had been trying to get inside for that? What if he had not run? I thought about the way he had stood there watching me, waiting. If I had opened that door, if I had stepped outside, would I have been the next victim? I left that job not long after. The management refused to hire a second night staff member, even after what had happened. The on-call supervisor never answered for weekend emergencies, and I knew I could not do it alone anymore. For years, I tried to push that night out of my mind. But every so often, when I am alone late at night, I still hear that doorbell, and I wonder what would have happened if I had answered it. Some doors are not meant to be opened. Some warnings should not be ignored. But what do you think? Was it a coincidence, or was that man specifically targeting our facility? Let me know in the comments if you dare. Story 6. The door creaked open at 2 a.m. It was a side door, one that no one ever used except for deliveries. My heart pounded as I looked up from my game console, expecting to see my boss or a truck driver. Instead, I saw a man. He stood at the far end of the warehouse, silent, unmoving. The dim overhead lights barely touched his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. Then, in a slow, steady voice, he asked, "Do you believe in Jesus, our Lord and Savior?" And in that moment, the only thing running through my mind was, I guess I am about to meet him. I used to work the night shift at a remote warehouse in Goldsmith, Texas, a tiny desert town where nothing but oil rigs and empty roads stretched for miles. The warehouse sat at the end of a rusty, unmarked dirt road, nearly a mile and a half from the nearest highway. It was the kind of place where, if something bad happened, no one would know for days. Most nights, it was just me and my boss, James. He was always late, but he never showed up later than 8 p.m. That night, when 9:45 rolled around and he was still not there, I called him. His voice was slurred when he answered, drunk again, said he would come in when he felt like it. I shrugged it off. I had work to do, inventory, painting received tools, logging shipments. After that, I killed time playing Xbox in the office while waiting for a truck to arrive. Then, at 2 a.m., I heard the side door open. The sound sent an instant chill through me. That door was far from the main entrance, out of sight, tucked at the very end of the warehouse. I expected to see James, or maybe a driver arriving early, but when I looked out the window, my stomach dropped. It was not James, and it was not a driver I recognized. The man stood there, just inside the doorway, his silhouette barely visible under the dim lighting. I called out, "Hey, are you a driver?" No response. Something about his stillness unsettled me. He just stood there, watching, my hands clenched into fists as I tried to think. Should I run? Lock the door? Grab something? Then, in a voice that was too calm, too slow, He asked, "Do you believe in Jesus, our Lord and Savior?" For a split second, I thought this was it. This was how I died. I could not move. I could barely think. All I knew was that I was alone in a warehouse in the middle of the Texas desert, miles from help, and this man was blocking the only exit. I swallowed hard and forced my voice to stay steady. "Yeah, man. Sure." He nodded, stepping closer. "That is good," he said. "Jesus saves." I felt a bead of sweat roll down my back. "You lost or something?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, as if my heart was not slamming against my ribs. He sighed, rubbing his face. "I just need $20 to catch a bus," he muttered. "I am trying to get clean. Heroin, you know." The shift in tone threw me off. 1 second, I thought he was going to kill me, and the next he sounded tired, broken. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a $20 bill. "Here, man, just take it." He stared at the money for a long moment before nodding. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the same door he had come through. I waited until he was completely gone before I locked the doors, every single one of them. I sat there, hands still shaking, replaying the entire encounter in my head. It could have ended differently. He could have stabbed me, shot me, dragged me out into the desert and left me there. And no one would have found me for days, because that happens out here a lot. I knew of people who had disappeared, their bodies dumped in oil fields, their cars abandoned on the side of the road. I had no doubt how easily I could have become one of them. And the scariest part, no one would have come looking until my shift was over. I still think about that night, about how a simple shift at work almost turned into something unimaginably worse. Maybe he really was just a desperate man looking for money to get clean. Or maybe, if I had said the wrong thing, he would have killed me right then and there. Story 7. The first time I heard it, I told myself it was my imagination. A piano. Faint, distant. The slow, haunting notes drifting down from the attic of the empty church. I had been cleaning alone for hours. No one else was supposed to be here. That piano was broken, or at least I thought it was. I crept up the stairs, my breath shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears. The music stopped the moment I reached the attic door. I turned to leave, telling myself it was nothing, when suddenly, from the far end of the room, behind a rusted metal door, bang! That was the last night I ever worked alone. I used to clean a small church late at night, long after the last service had ended, when the building sat in heavy silence. It was peaceful, in a way. The smell of old wood, candle wax, and dust hanging thick in the air. But there was one place that never felt right. The attic. The attic was nothing more than a storage space packed with forgotten hymn books, old wooden chairs, and one out-of-tune piano. I had been told it was broken, which was why it had been abandoned up there. No one ever used it. No one ever should have used it. But that night, it played on its own. It was just past 11:45 p.m. when I first heard the sound. The notes were slow, deliberate. They floated down from the attic like they were being played by careful hands. I froze. For a long moment, I tried to tell myself it was something else. The wind, an old pipe shifting, but no explanation made sense. The church was locked. I was the only one inside. The unease in my chest grew heavier. My hands were clammy as I grabbed my flashlight and made my way up the narrow staircase leading to the attic. Each step creaked under my weight, the wooden boards groaning like they were warning me not to go further. Then, just as I reached the door, the music stopped. I pushed the door open slowly, my flashlight cutting through the dust-filled air. Everything was still. The piano sat in the corner, untouched. The wooden chairs were stacked neatly against the walls. Nothing was out of place. I let out a shaky breath. Maybe it had been my mind playing tricks on me. I turned to leave, and then, from the far side of the attic, behind an old metal storage door, bang! I jumped back, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. The sound had been loud, not a creak, not a soft shuffle, but a full-force impact, like something was inside the storage closet, trying to get out. My breath came in sharp gasps as I gripped my flashlight tighter. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. I stepped backward slowly, my eyes locked on the door, half expecting it to fly open. But nothing happened. I turned and bolted down the stairs, not stopping until I reached the main hall. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and tried to call my supervisor. No answer. She never picked up on night shifts. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm myself down. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. Then, around 12:15 a.m., one of the church lights flickered, and the piano started playing again. I refused to go back upstairs. I sat in the church office, pretending I could not hear the distant, eerie notes drifting down the stairwell. The next day, I confronted the only other night shift cleaner. an older woman named Margaret. "Have you ever heard anything strange in the church?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Margaret gave me a tired look and sighed. "You heard it, huh?" I swallowed hard. "The piano?" She nodded. "The piano. The banging. Sometimes footsteps." My stomach twisted. "What is behind that metal door in the attic?" Margaret hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I do not know, and I do not want to know." She refused to say anything else. I spent the next few days digging through old records, trying to find anything about the church's past. It had been built in the early 1900s, originally serving as a small schoolhouse before being converted into a place of worship. There were stories, rumors about strange happenings, but nothing concrete. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. In 1956, a young pianist had been found dead inside the church. She had been practicing late at night, alone. The next morning, the priest found her slumped over the piano, her hands still resting on the keys. No signs of struggle, no explanation for why she had died. The attic had been locked ever since. I stared at the old article, my hands trembling. The piano, the music, the metal door. Was she still up there? I quit my job the next day. I never went back. But sometimes, when I pass by the church at night, I slow down and listen. And I swear, if you stand close enough, you can still hear the piano playing. Soft, slow, waiting. Some places do not forget. Some souls do not rest. But what do you think? Was it just a coincidence? Or is there something still lingering in that church? Story 8. The hallway lights flickered as I reached the final set of doors. I had been cleaning alone for hours, following the same routine I did every night. I locked the first set of doors, walked the full length of the U-shaped wing, and finally reached the last exit. I switched off the lights, plunging the corridor into darkness, and then something moved. At the far end of the hallway, a shadow, a child-sized figure, darted across from left to right. Fast. Too fast. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. I had just locked every single door. No one should have been there. But I was not alone. I used to work as a night shift custodian at a middle school. The job was simple. Clean the classrooms, mop the floors, take out the trash. The school was a long, U-shaped building, and my job was to lock up one end of the wing before making my way around to the other. Most nights were uneventful, just the quiet hum of the air conditioning, the occasional creak of an old wooden desk, and the distant ticking of the hallway clock. But every now and then, I would catch something, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. a shape just beyond the edge of my flashlight. I always told myself it was just exhaustion, just my mind playing tricks on me. Until that night. It was close to 10:45 p.m. when I finished my rounds. I had already locked the first set of doors at the far end of the wing and had just reached the final exit, ready to lock up and leave. The entire hallway stretched behind me, empty and silent. I reached for the light switch, and as soon as the lights went out, a figure ran across the hallway. It was small, fast, a dark silhouette, like the shadow of a child. It darted from one side of the hallway to the other, disappearing through a locked door. My entire body went cold. I had been in that wing alone for hours. I had personally checked every classroom, locked every door, turned off every light. There was no way anyone could still be inside, but I had seen it. My legs felt heavy, locked in place as my mind raced through possibilities. Could it have been a stray animal? No, the shape was too human. A trick of the lights? Maybe. But the hallway was pitch black. There was no light left to cast shadows. I took a step back. My fingers fumbled over the key ring, searching for the one that locked the hallway doors to the rest of the school. My breathing was shallow, uneven. I turned the key, and then I ran. I did not stop until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the key in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I glanced back at the school. Through the darkened windows, the empty classroom stood in eerie stillness. Nothing moved, nothing stirred, but I could not shake the feeling that something was watching me. That was the first night I left without finishing my shift. The next morning, I hesitated before telling anyone. I expected to be laughed at, told it was just exhaustion or an overactive imagination. But when I finally mentioned it to another custodian, an older man who had worked at the school for years, he did not laugh. Instead, he just nodded. "You saw him," he said. His tone was matter-of-fact, as if this was something normal. I swallowed hard. "Who?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Few of us have seen it. The little shadow kid, always at the end of the hallway, always running, never makes a sound." A chill crawled up my spine. "Who is he?" The man shrugged. "No one knows. Some say there was an accident here years ago. A student who got locked inside after hours fell down the stairs. Maybe worse, but there is no record of it." I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe it was just an urban legend, a story passed down by night staff to keep things interesting. But I knew what I had seen. After that night, I never worked alone again. I always made sure someone was in the building with me, even if it was just another custodian finishing their shift. But sometimes, even with company, I would catch glimpses, a flicker of movement in the distance, a shadow shifting just out of sight. And once, just as I was locking the doors for the night, I swear I heard it. The faint sound of small footsteps running down the hallway. When I turned around, there was nothing there. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales that explore the mysterious intersections between our world and the unknown. Have you ever experienced an encounter that made you question the fabric of reality? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.